This last week, there's been a lot in the news about speaking and listening, hasn't there? President Trump has been stopped from speaking via Twitter, and lots of his followers have been listening to voices that convince them that their election victory has been stolen. Speaking and listening, interpreting and making sense of what we hear has never been as crucial. In this reading, here's the young Samuel, the boy prophet, and God calling in the night, and Samuel's eventual realization that this was indeed God calling. For most of us, though, it's never going to be that clear. So what might God's voice sound like then? There's that famous, wonderful passage in the book of Kings where Elijah's hiding in a cave and there's a mighty wind and then an earthquake and then a fire, but God was not in any of them. And then a sound of sheer silence. And silence is a good place to start, quietening our busy minds enough to be attentive to the sound of sheer silence or the still small voice. Father Thomas Keating says, silence is God's first language. Everything else is a poor translation. In order to hear that language, he says, we must learn to be still and to rest in God. Certainly there's the example of Jesus himself, who used to withdraw by himself to pray. There's Dr. Martin Luther King, great preacher, pastor, civil rights activist in the 1960s, who regularly took a day of silence to pray and plan and listen. And a tradition throughout all the centuries of Christianity of seeking God in the silence. If we can get it, our hour of outdoor exercise can be a good time for finding some stillness. It can be an opportunity to look and listen to what's happening in our neighbourhood and to wonder at nature, at the sky, at the first signs of new life returning and of spring. As Elizabeth Barrett Browning said, earth's crammed with heaven and every common bush afire with God, but only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round it and pluck blackberries. Seeing the heaven and the fire of God in nature and in our everyday experience is good. But sometimes it's not so obvious to us. Sometimes the bush is just a bush with no glory and no blackberries even. The news can give us that too, can give us glimpses of the world in all its glory and awesomeness, and its people at their noblest and at their worst, which brings us back to Mr. Trump and to COVID. How to respond to COVID. We can feel just very small and helpless in the crisis, can't we? There's a temptation to want to look away lest we be overwhelmed. And yet, we bring our longing, our fears and hopes, our prayers, in words or wordless. We offer it all to God, who alone can bear it, bears it all, and who is listening to us. There's a poem by R.S. Thomas called The Other that expresses it. It tells about that other who is awake with us through the dark night and bears our wordless prayers. It goes like this. There are nights that are so still that I can hear the small owl calling far off and a fox barking miles away. It is then that I lie in the lean hours awake, listening to the swell born somewhere in the Atlantic, rising and falling, wave on the long shore by the village that is without light and companionless. And the thought comes of that other being who is awake too, letting our prayers break on him. Not like this for a few hours, but for days, years, for eternity. Amen.